Hello! Today I'm taking a look at Yojimbo, a Final Fantasy summon that stands distinct among my favourites, but is also curiously one of the lesser featured entities to populate the Final Fantasy series. Now, unlike the summons we've previously discussed, Yojimbo is a comparatively recent inclusion to the Final Fantasy games, and something of an anomaly insofar as it debuted in Final Fantasy X back in 2001, but rather than becoming a recurring entity to enter the pantheon and get into the swing of things, it's only inched slightly beyond Final Fantasy X, featuring in Final Fantasy X-2, Final Fantasy XIV, and some of the smaller supplementary Final Fantasy media. Now, jumping right in and looking at the origins of Yojimbo, it is one of the few summons I can think of that draws upon a distinctly Japanese heritage, rather than the cultures and mythologies from further afield. And looking first at its design, we can see a distinct aesthetic that's reminiscent of not only Final Fantasy X's vibrant style, but also the ukiyo-e floating world paintings of Edo period Japan. Beyond that, and while highly abstracted, Yojimbo also has a vaguely Ronin attire, with the jinkasa hat, the flowing robes reminiscent of a kimono, the kabuki-like face mask, and of course the array of weapons such as the kazuka, the wakizashi, and the katana. So each of these elements, along with other subtleties like the cherry blossom grove that appears when his animation comes in, lean to the pop cultural ideas of samurai and leaderless ronin wandering the vistas of Edo period Japan. But further to this, based on the names and the function of Yojimbo, there's further evidence of both cultural and specifically pop cultural elements that emerge out of Japanese media. So firstly, Yojimbo itself is a term for bodyguard, which was hugely popularised in the mid-20th century by the Akira Kurosawa film Yojimbo, the same name. And here, the concept of a travelling ronin who accepts protection work for payment was established among moviegoers and audiences, much further outside of Japan. And Toshiro Mifune's stoic, pragmatic ronin figure became a blueprint for the pop cultural wandering ronin thereafter, from which Final Fantasy X's silent Yojimbo operates in a very similar function. The second term that nods to Japanese pop culture is Yojimbo's dog, Daigoro, and Daigoro is also the name for the son and ward of a wandering ronin in the manga and TV show Lone Wolf and Cub, which I discovered comparatively recently, in part due to its influence on the Mandalorian TV series. But much the same as Yojimbo having this ever-present partner in the form of the dog Daigoro, so too does the lone wolf have his cub of the same name. So beyond these pop cultural references, what I really love about Yojimbo is how he's one of these summonable rarities that operate on their own terms, and much like Odin in Final Fantasy VIII, he has a unique non-player determinate ability that distinguishes him from other summons. And here we can see how these Ronin traits are applied in-game, because rather than utilising attacks and standard abilities, Yojimbo, like the Ronin of yore, requires payment for his services, and his calibre of attack corresponds directly to the ratio of payment offered, which fluctuates also depending on parameters of a given battle and the party's compatibility with him. And I'm sure I'm not the only one who's done this, but in many instances of playing Final Fantasy X, when I come to one of the final bosses that I just can't be bothered to fight, I do just throw all of my money at Yojimbo and hope for the Zanmato. Now, in keeping with this idea of Ronin, and another point I found a while ago online that I had to look up and confirm was true, which it is, but I saw a blog by some fans that were invested in deciphering the Yevonite alphabet that is featured throughout Final Fantasy X, and they had identified among many of the instances of this text that Yojimbo's faith artwork has the phrase mea culpa written across it in Yevonite. And this is interesting, and it's symbolic in two key ways for me, because firstly, mea culpa is a Latin Catholic phrase that is uttered as a form of confession or regret in church. So this further bridges the Yevon faith with the analogue of the Catholic Church, which I've discussed in my recent Final Fantasy X reviews. But furthermore, and looking to the Japanese connotations, this sort of regret and lamentable sort of term is that when we look at the wandering ronin, these masterless samurai that Yojimbo is modelled on, in Japanese society, to be a ronin was generally considered a cause for shame, and although we have these popular ideas of ronin such as Yojimbo and Satoichi being pretty cool, the term really denotes a homeless wanderer living hand to mouth in Japanese society, who in many instances had lost the favour of their master and so had been cast out of the samurai class. So it's very interesting that Yojimbo has an expression of regret embossed across his artwork like this that could denote this sort of Ronin status. But of course it could relate to some in-game lore particular to Final Fantasy X too, such as the cause of him being a hidden Aeon, and so on. So that wraps up my brief look at Yojimbo, an Aeon that I'm really quite fond of, but understandably he doesn't slot into all of the worlds and settings of Final Fantasy, owing to his rather distinct traditional sort of vibe that might reasonably jar with some of the futuristic or quasi-medieval settings that many of the Final Fantasies have. But nonetheless, I think he was a very memorable inclusion to the world and setting of Final Fantasy X, and as I say, a summon that I really quite like. So if you got this far, thanks very much for listening. I hope you enjoyed it. And feel free to drop a comment below. Let me know your thoughts and opinions on the anomaly that was Yojimbo.